Whenever conversations about how much organisms can change over time come up, and you're talking to a young Earth creationist, you're bound to hear the term genetic entropy. This term has become increasingly popular in the young Earth creationist literature over the last 10 years, usually in reference to why evolutionary theory can't work in the long term. But it's also increasingly gaining a foothold as an explanation for why the Earth must be young, that life on Earth can't have existed for very long because of this thing called genetic entropy. My goal today is not to get into all the arguments the young Earth creationists have about why this is so in terms of the present day genetic variation. Rather, I'm interested in looking forward and seeing what the implications of young Earth creationist beliefs about genetic entropy have for the future of organisms here on Earth and even the future of the human race. So I've titled this Genetic Entropy Endgame. What is the endgame for young Earth creationists as in their appeals to this particular idea of genetic entropy? But also endgame, what's the endgame for life on Earth if genetic entropy, according to their definition, is a real phenomena? So I've subtitled this, It's the End of the World as We Know It, and creationists seem to be fine with it. Why is that? What is it about their beliefs of what is to come in the world that make genetic entropy appealing not only as an explanation for the past, but also for the future? That's coming up. So what do young Earth creationists mean by genetic entropy? What is this term? Well, here, this definition by Price in 2019, simply put, genetic entropy means that the information content in the genome, all of our genes, is progressively declining due to the accumulation of mutations. So there's this infamous word in young Earth creationist literature, information. And here he's defining that as information is the genome, or all the genes, or all the programs that make an organism what it is. And the claim here is that because of genetic entropy, and which is caused by an accumulation of mutations, that information is progressively being lost from a genome or is being corrupted in the genome. So individual mutations are breaking programs, resulting in the organisms being able to perform fewer functions, presumably, than they could before. And this is illustrated here below in a image from Answers in Genesis, which Ken Ham used to use very frequently in his talks, where you have this wolf, right? And the wolf then represents sort of the better genome, or the original genome, or something closer to the original created kind genome. And then what's happened is it's lost information to be a coyote. I really don't understand why a coyote is somehow inferior to a wolf in terms of its genetic content. But nonetheless, maybe it's just because they're smaller. And then there's more information lost, presumably through mutations, and then more lost in collies, and then eventually more lost in chihuahuas. And so this also goes with their idea of genetic sorting, right? There's a large pool of genetic variation. It's sorted out into smaller sets that have less information, fewer variants in them. And so you have this gradual loss of information over time, resulting in what Ken Ham would say is an inferior organism compared to the original created kind. So that quote came from Paul Price in a article called Genetic Entropy, the Silent Killer, a devastating, powerful argument against evolution. And you see, the gist of the argument is organisms started with perfect genomes, right? Perfect meaning every single program was ideal, and there were no mistakes in that original programming. And if you start out with perfection, the only place you can go from there is breaking perfection, right? You have mutations, which are clearly visible in the world and observed, and therefore the original programs are being damaged, and no new information is added. That's the other part of this criteria, is that you can't actually add new information. You'll see that in the young Earth creationist literature all the time. And so if you can't add information, but you're constantly subtracting it, what's going to happen to organisms over time? Well, they're going to decay in a way. All right. This entropy, information is lost. And this is reflected in many other articles in the Young Earth Creationist literature. Here's just a few. Carl Weiland wrote an entire book, The World Winding Down. All right. So again, the idea of beginning in perfection. Sin introduces mutations to the world. Mutations then begin to decay all the different organisms on Earth. And so the world is wearing down, both biologically but also physically. Jeffrey Tompkins, genetic entropy points to a young Earth. And here we see this then becomes a way of arguing for a young Earth, somewhat indirectly, but nonetheless, you say, all right, so if we look back, if we look at the condition of organisms now, we see they're filled with mutations. If we just work backwards, we'd find that fewer and fewer mutations, and eventually we're going to work back to that perfect state of an organism. And if you ask how quick, what would happen to those perfect animals over time if the world had started with perfect genomes, all right, a million years ago, and all you did was accumulate mutations, then those organisms would be long dead, right? They couldn't survive to present because there's no mechanism to avoid this entropy, right? Genetic entropy is seen as an unavoidable thing, just like, physicists would talk about entropy as something no one can avoid, the action of entropy in our world, the loss of useful energy. So I'm reminded by the song, when the world is running down, you make the best of what's still around. And that's sort of the creationist attitude at this point. It's like, we're just doing the best with what we have. But what's their vision for the future? Their vision for the future is the world cannot get any better. In their mind, there's no mechanism for the world getting better because no new information can evolve. And all the current information is decaying. And so there is a limited lifespan to this earth. And that's that's what I want to talk about here, is we want to look at the eschatology of creationists. What is their future vision of the end of the world, and what will happen there? So what will happen is genetic entropy will destroy life as we know it. All right, now here we go to John Sanford, who's probably the major figure in sort of establishing this argument of genetic entropy and the decay of genomes, from his book from 2008, Genetic Entropy and the Mystery of the Genome. So in that book, John Sanford has written, the extinction of the human genome appears to be just as certain and deterministic as the extinction of stars, the death of organisms, and the heat death of the universe. So he's relating genetic entropy, or the genome decaying, to what is acknowledged as the decay, or what eventual decay of all the other things around us in the universe. And he's saying, yes, the human genome will go extinct. Now, he certainly has a different timeline in view here, and it's not extinct over, like for the universe, maybe billions of years from now, but in very short time. Likewise, we see Williams in the Journal of Creation in 2015 writes, the inescapable conclusion is that humans must have been created with mutation-free, healthy genomes just a few thousand years ago, and their future is likewise limited to thousands, not millions of years. And so this is actually an application of uniformitarianism, right, by young Earth creationists. They're saying if we look at the mutation rate in present-day humans and we extrapolate back, well, they must have been created not too long ago as mutation-free, healthy genomes. All right, we might be able to infer that from the scriptures, but nonetheless, working backwards from here's all the mutations that are in the human race now, as so we know sort of the general rate in which more are being added. If we work backwards, eventually we get to what? A perfect genome with no mutations in it. And according to our calculations, that wasn't that long ago, right? Just thousands of years ago. Now do the reverse, though. Do the flip. And this is my challenge, all right? This is the reason I'm making this video, is that think about what young Earth creationists are saying about the future, not just the past. All right? Their future is likewise limited to thousands, not millions of years. Just thousands of years from now, the expectation is that human beings essentially are going to mutate themselves out of existence. Right? We'll become less and less fit for our environment. And this then actually is true for all the other living things on Earth as well. So as we stand here, we are in the midst of a massive collapse of life. And the extinction of life on Earth is actually not far out for us in the future. Right. So these things have some implications with respect to attitudes that young Earth creationists have if they really are taking this kind of argument seriously. And I think this kind of argument is becoming more and more common in their literature, and I think will eventually be infused into their followers. But if you take this particular view of the future of humanity, it has some pretty significant impacts on how we understand the world around us today, and how we treat the world around us today. But we'll get to the implications at the end here. I just want to introduce this idea of genetic decay a little bit more. So here's a popular figure I've seen in multiple different publications, but here we have a one from Institute for Creation Research. Genetic entropy points to a young Earth. All right, that same article I just referenced before. And here they're showing one of the evidences of it, and this is what John Sanford would also point to, right? And this is image from Sanford. After the flood, human lifespan quickly began to decline. So they're saying, okay, so you have the flood, and then what do we notice? Well, we see that human lifespans went from 100 down to, within 20 generations into the 100 mark, and then a little bit below that, which is about where we are presently. And so this is exponential decay, of lifespan. And what was that exponential decay of lifespan caused by? They would argue genomic decay. They started with a perfect genome. We now have a bunch of different genetic diseases which cause problems in our genomes over time. And so accounting longer lifespans as being a more perfect genome, which was what allowed individuals to live longer, he can point to this as being an example of genetic decay. And eventually that decay, now in this case, it shows it kind of flattening out, but it's still, the implication, you just saw from the quotes I gave you that eventually mutations are still building up in the human race, according to John Sanford. And so therefore, lifespans will continue to go down. So what's allowing human beings to still live 70 years on average? It's technology, right? So you would say that, well, in the short term, technology can reverse the trend of entropy, of genetic entropy, and get around the fact that, accommodate for the fact that we're increasing our mutational load. But eventually the mutational load is going to take over. It doesn't matter what our technology is. It's basically going to kill us, right? It's going to cause the extinction of the human race. Okay, with that very general introduction to genetic entropy and young Earth creationist use of genetic entropy, I'm going to do something a little bit more speculative now. I want to just explore these ideas through a series of graphs in which I try to illustrate what young Earth creationists think has happened to life and the diversity of life over time since creation. But I'm also going to map what I think young Earth creationists envision happening to biological diversity into the future. And so I have a series of figures here in which I'm going to make some drawings and talk about that as I do that. I am very interested in feedback on this. This is sort of me just kind of on the top of my head, using young Earth creationist literature, what I know of it, what they have said, but also having to speculate what they may think about this, because in many cases, I don't think they've fully fleshed this out, or if they've thought about it, they haven't written about it explicitly. All right, so we're going to start with what I'm going to call the genetic entropy endgame, right, from the title of my slide. We're going to think about, what does genetic entropy lead to? I've created this scale, and I'm calling it genetic or genome robustness. And so 1.0 would be perfect genome, right? There's no mistakes in it, and every program is operating right, and every piece of the genome has its purpose according to the creator in this case. All right, God made these kinds with a genome, and every young Earth creationist would agree that first genome it couldn't be improved upon, right? And so its genome robustness, I'm going to call it, should be a 1.0. Genome robustness of a 0 would be you're extinct, all right? You obviously don't have a genome that functions well enough for you to survive. So if we think about overall, you can think of any particular organism you wish, or maybe you want to think of a kind, like let's think about the canine kind, where young Earth creationists say that God created a few individuals or two individuals, or anyway, they produce some kind of proto-canine that survived through the flood as two individuals and then became lots of different species afterwards. And that's allowed within their scheme of sort of hyper rapid evolution after the flood. But now we're thinking about, what does the genome look like during this time frame? So it's going to start out as a one, right? That first canine or first canines, all of them would have had perfect genomes, whether there was a 10,000 of them on the earth or God created just two to start out with. But immediately, days after they're created, right, you have the fall of Adam, the entering of sin into the world, which for young earth creationists means the kicking off of the allowance of mutations. And so genomes now can accumulate errors that are negative to the organism, right? Not beneficial, not neutral, but actually are problems. They reduce genetic information over time in their language. And so you're going to have to see that it's going to start to decay, right? So the genomes, even if this is one individual, 100 individual, 1,000 individuals, they're all decaying. So as they replicate, they make errors, and those errors accumulate such that the offspring don't have the perfect genome of the original one. So by the time you get to the flood, you're going to select out two individuals, right? Noah only brought two individuals onto the ark. Now, we could say, I'm going to give them the benefit of doubt. Let's say that God selected and brought to the ark two individuals that hadn't experienced quite as much decay, because there could be different rates of decay depending on the circumstances the organisms are living in. So maybe he brought two organisms that didn't have as decayed overall. So this line is sort of the average. But let's say those two individuals were a little better off than the average genome in terms of genome robustness. So they get a little boost at the flood because we've now sampled the better genomes. Well, what happens after the flood? Well, after the flood, genome decay begins, continues, right? And so mutations accumulate almost in a clock-like pattern. At least this would be one hypothesis. All right. And as they decay, all right, presumably that means the organism, just like Ken Ham's picture, wolves then are decaying into domesticated dogs, which don't have nearly the information that a wolf has in it. And he would point to, like, domesticated dogs have all kinds of genetic problems and so forth, and they can't even really survive on their own, right? They're dependent on us, and so this is a sign of them not being as perfect of an organism or having as good of a genome as they originally did. But what's the rate of that decay? Now that's a little hard to elucidate from their literature. And there's also several possible patterns. One is you could have exponential decay. You could have very fast decay originally, and then this would go with a human drop in lifespan. So they might point to, oh look, human population lifespan dropped very quickly and exponential decay, and then it kind of asymptoted out, right? And so you still have decay, but organisms are not seeing as much morphological change, all right, in their lives. The other possibility is that originally, because of small populations, maybe the decay wasn't as serious, and also other effects might have been able to get rid of negative mutations like natural selection. Although that's in small let's not even go into the small population thing. Let's try to keep it simple here. So maybe decay doesn't occur very quickly, but then over time it begins to accumulate, especially as maybe populations get very large, at least in the mindset of young earth creationists, huge populations, more opportunities for mutations, and so decay begins, and maybe it accelerates over time. All right, that would be another possible pattern. Depending on the pattern, you're going to get a different, right? I have like 4,000 years, right? That's 2,000 years from now. Where will things be 2,000 years from now? I think all creationists would agree that the genomes will be decayed compared to what they are today. How's that going to affect the number of species on Earth? It probably reduce the number of species on Earth. But anyway, so we've got the idea here. All right, genomes will only get worse. Right, in the young Earth creationist model, there's nothing that can rescue this genetic entropy, and it's inevitable. All genomes will slide toward oblivion, really, and eventually kill off their host. So let's think about a couple other aspects, though, of organisms' history, life history, and the history on Earth. So let's think about vertebrate species diversity. I'm sticking to vertebrates because those would be like land vertebrates would have been on the Noah's Ark in the young Earth model. So that way we need to consider the flood. All right, so vertebrate species diversity. What was the original species diversity in the original creation? That's highly, I would say I was going to say hotly debated among Earth creationists, but actually they rarely talk about it at all. It's as if I've always wondered why, but it seems like it's a really important question. If God created 6,000 years ago all the different vertebrate kinds, if he created a kind, was the kind just two individuals? Or could the kind have been lots and lots and lots of different species, but all in the same kind, but all created at the very same moment, the same day of creation? But considering they're all the same, in other words, they don't actually share a common ancestor, but he kind of declares that these are all one kind and they can all interbreed and they can influence each other through time. Well, okay, so species diversity, maybe it was actually quite low. All right, if it was low, that means God only created one species for every kind. A few individuals, or maybe 100,000 individuals, but maybe they're all alike. That's something you and I would call a species. Or maybe he created a whole lot of species. All right, I mean there's a lot of dinosaur species. There's a lot of when you look at the fossil record, there's millions of different species that aren't alive today. Maybe all of those were created and were originally there. But I think the preferred model is that there weren't that many species, and then between the creation and the flood, they were allowed to diversify. So if each kind diversified, then the species numbers would go up. All right, so this is a mess. Let's get rid of this. I'm just going to pick a point and say, here's how there was a lot of diversity, but not as much. But that diversity must have increased very rapidly, and it would have reached probably right before the flood, the absolute peak. In other words, 1.0 here would be like max amount, the most that has ever been seen on Earth before the flood. I say that because the fossil record, which is said to be created by the flood, contains an absolutely astronomical number of different species in it. Far more species are extinct than are alive today. And so the diversity right at the onset of the flood must have been absolutely enormous. And so either it was created, all that diversity was created here and simply remained for 1,600 years, or it was created as proto versions of these kinds and then allowed to diversify very rapidly, like we're going to talk about after the flood. But nonetheless, at the flood, you got max amount of diversity. And then what happens at the flood? Well, the number of species goes way down here, right? It goes all the way down to 1,300 species, 1,300 kinds, which would be 1,300 species at that point, because there's only two individuals. Have to consider those same species at that point. And then immediately, what happens after the flood? Well, after the flood, we say that diversity increased massively. Right? There was two canines on the ark, but then within a few hundred years, we have records, in biblical records, of multiple different species of canines. Right? We have foxes and wolves and coyotes and domesticated dogs. All right? And so all that diversity had to have come from those two individuals, and it exploded. I've drawn this too high. I really should have drawn it up here because it didn't go nearly as high as in the past in terms of overall diversity. There might be many more canines after the flood than there were before the flood, but in terms of total diversity, that's the image I'm trying to get across here. It would have peaked out, and then what's happened since? Diversity has declined, all right, because there's been extinction. There's been a lot of extinction. I mean, even the canines, more than half of all the canines that we know about are extinct. And so if you say, this is the canines, well, canines go up there, canines go down. They're at least to that halfway point now, right? Half of them are gone. There's been a lot of extinction. And based on the rate of extinction over the past, what's the projection for the future? This direction, right? Not more species, but fewer species into the future. There could be a couple reasons for that, because let's think also about total genetic diversity. We're looking at three aspects of diversity and genomes before we kind of put it together and ask, how did young Earth creationists make all of this jive? Or do they make it jive at all? So let's think about total genetic diversity. Now I'm talking about, I'm not talking about the genome being perfect. I'm talking about the amount of total genetic diversity contained in genomes or in individuals. And so here's where you get to this idea of created heterozygosity that young earth creationists like to throw out there. They like to say that the original created kinds were just like chock full of diversity, variation. And so they had multiple different alleles. Now, all those alleles are perfect some way. They're not negative alleles. They're just variants, right? Different expressions of characteristics. So they have different versions of programs, but those programs are all good programs. They're not corrupted. So it's a ton of information, because for every program there's multiple different variants of that program, and they're all stored presumably in the original created kind. So then what happens to those? So if we were to say genetic diversity, where was it at the max? We'd say at the very initiation, right? The very point at which these organisms are created, they contain the greatest amount of a genetic diversity. What happens after creation is they begin to propagate, right? And then they begin to separate out that genetic diversity into different pools, which we would call different species. So speciation happens. And so you're creating various different species. And as you do so, each one of them only contains a subset of the original variation. But, presumably if you added up all this variation, it would still be all of the original variation. Now, you have to admit there's going to be some loss. There's going to be some rare alleles that might get lost. And so you won't stay at one, the complete max number of variants. You're going to slide somewhat, right? So you're going to lose some variation over time. And of course, we're going to combine this with genetic entropy, which creates greater losses. But let's pretend like genetic entropy doesn't occur right now, and we're just talking about what happens through natural replication, recombination, and then of course natural selection happening on these two. So you lose some variation, and you get to the flood. Well, now what happens? If you've separated out the original pool of variation into 20 separate piles of variation, which we're going to call different species, represented by multiple individuals, each of which don't have all the variation even within that species. When you go to select just 2 animals to survive on the flood, they can't possibly contain all the variation of this original created kind, right? And so you're going to lose something. Well, let's say we lose half of our variation. I think I'm being generous, okay? But let's say that you only lose half the variation, half of all those alleles, because the packages you kept don't contain all the original variation. What happens after the flood to genetic variation? It can't go up, because if you were to say there were going to be more variants, more versions of programs after the flood to create new variations in organisms, that'd be like saying you're adding information. Now, okay, there are a few creationists who would say that there can be beneficial mutations that create like variants of programs. So you can't create all new programs. So you can create a new variant of a gene that creates a tweak on a feature. And that creates, new hair colors or curly hair instead of straight hair or something like that, which is a way of admitting you can create new characteristics in organisms even, since they were created. And so that would be like, oh, actually you can add new characters. They're going to cheat. I call it cheating, and say that that's not actually adding new information. They're going to say that's just tweaking the programs that are already good there. All right, so let's say that a little bit of that can happen, but what is mostly happening is they're once again separating the genetics into different pools, and in small pools, small populations, you'll have genetic drift, which will reduce the amount of genetic variation over time. So genetic variation overall is lost, even if you're gaining a little bit. And in the young earth creationist literature, there is an admittance that there could be some slight gains, but still the losses greatly outweigh the gains. And so there is a overall net loss of information over time. So where does it go? If we're just talking about overall genetic diversity on Earth, that's what we're talking about, not an individual thing right now. It goes down, it goes way down in the flood, and then it's just on a downward decline, right? It can't do anything but go down in the young earth creationist model. And of course, this is going to be helped out. I mean, I'm saying they're going to say it goes down just because of the way population genetics works, and recombination and then selecting of characters in new environments, you're going to lose alleles over time. All right, what about genetic entropy? We got to add on the genetic entropy. Don't you think that genetic entropy is just going to make this go down faster? I certainly would think so, because you're now not only just losing some alleles, variants of programs, you're also corrupting genes with mutations such that they don't work at all. That's definitely a loss of genetic information that can be useful to that organism. So now let's map on total numbers of vertebrate kinds, not species. Let's go all the way to kinds and think about how many different kinds there are. And what's the future of kinds, the past of kinds and the future of kinds, the diversity of kinds. And I just want to remind you that, Answers in Genesis and the Ark encounter, they're very explicit right here. 1,398 animal kinds on the Ark. And this number of individual animals themselves, those would be vertebrate animals, land animals on the Ark. So they have an accounting of them. Then they have a figure, actually it's right over here, that actually lists all the different kinds are on the Ark. So I'm going to say, though, that's really convenient. We now know how many kinds God created on the 5th and 6th days of creation. And so we know that's our starting point. That's our total number of kinds. And that young earth creationists don't believe new kinds can be created. So that number, 1,398, remember, vertebrate kinds, vertebrate land animal kinds, can't increase. This would be true for all other kinds of all other organisms as well. Let's just focus on those vertebrate animal kinds. So, let me get rid of this. All right, so let's map on total numbers of vertebrate kinds. And what happens there? All right, well, we're starting again with species diversity. I should have said this should be kinds. Number of kinds. Total numbers of kinds. But if we were to say where was the max number of kinds in world history, they would say right at creation, right? There can't be any more kinds than that. And then what happened after that? Well, then this is interesting. For young earth creationists, they would say, well, look, there were 1,398, or I've already forgotten the number now, 89, or whatever that number was on the previous slide. And that number must have stayed the same all the way for 1,650 years from creation to the flood, because Noah was told to bring 2 of every kind. And they say what they mean by that, what they think that means, is 2 of every kind that God created at the beginning. I've never been sure why that couldn't just mean 2 of every kind that's still living today, and then allow for some of those kinds to have been lost. In other words, maybe the numbers of kinds went down, and then all of these were preserved by Noah. But nonetheless, that's not what young earth creationists usually say. They usually say all the kinds were still present. None of them were lost. Now, this kind of goes against the ideas we just presented, right? You see what's happening here? If genetic entropy is taking place for all those years, and you have genetic loss of alleles in populations, plus you have a world, right, which is semi-chaotic, all right? Things happen in that world, right? Because there's things killing things and sin and all this corruption of the world, right? You would think that some of those kinds might have been lost during that time. But let's grant them that no kinds went extinct, and Noah preserved every single one of them on the ark that was from the original creation. Then what happens after? And I think the assumption of most young earth creationists is that most of the kinds are still with us because, like, Noah preserved them, except for some notable, obvious exceptions, which everybody knows about, like dinosaurs, right? Dinosaurs were, there's none of them around. And so therefore, all the dinosaurs must have gone extinct. Well, there's other things that have also gone extinct. And it's not just a few things. I've taken a look at that list and I've looked through all those and added up the number of extinct kinds versus living kinds. Remember, a kind for them is a whole family, right? It's a family of things by standard classification system. And so 55% of all the kinds of organisms that God created, all vertebrate kinds of organisms that God created, they're not alive today. And since most of those aren't found in any of the rocks after the flood, this means that extinction had to have happened extremely rapidly. So let's go down to 50%. All right. Terrible line. So we drop very quickly. I mean, stuff is just going extinct right and left for the first 100 years after the flood. And then maybe some equilibrium point is reached. I probably should, let's do it again. Don't like what I got here. So, all right. So we go across here and then boom, we're going down, 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 down. And then we're kind of evening off. And then we're cruising across, but there is still some losses of kinds all the way up until today. There are some groups of organisms that are only known by one or two species, and those are fairly rare. So they're at a point where they could go extinct in the near future, right? They're endangered species. And for creationists, I think creationists should actually come up with a category, endangered kinds, right? And they should be talking about endangered kinds. There's a reason why they don't do that, and that's what's coming up. This is what I'm leading to, the future. All right? And so what's going to happen to kinds? They can't increase. They absolutely can't, because once extinct, they can't make more kinds because that's not allowed. In young Earth creationism, you can't gain information, and therefore you can't gain new, truly different characters and properties and distinguish yourself from other individuals in the same kind in order to become new kinds. So new kinds, not allowed. That form of evolution, not allowed. So they can only disappear. and they are disappearing. And you have genetic entropy occurring. And you have losses through normal population genetic mechanisms. And so what's the future of kinds? I mean, the future of kinds is not just a slow loss, but you would think that it should be increasingly an increasing loss over time. All right, now that gets us to, I'm going to try to put this all together. What are all these different factors and how do they interplay with each other? So we said that we have the number of kinds here, and then the kinds rapidly drop off, and then they're kind of going out here. We said that genetic, genomes start out perfect. So I had this thing called genome robustness of 1.0, and that robustness then immediately begins to get lost because of genetic entropy. I said maybe a small bump up, but then it's on a fall, right? Mutations accumulate. That's written over and over and over again in the creation science literature. Mutations are accumulating. Mutations, many of them are bad, and they're accumulating. And so they have to be destroying the genome over time, making it less efficient. And that has to continue. Now, the question is the pace at which it would continue. And then you have species that start out, but you have species increasing in number because you have diversification. So you have many different species formed. Then you have massive numbers of species losses. Then you have massive species gains, even in light of the kinds disappearing. So the kinds that survive, like a canine kind, goes from one species of canine all the way up to, something like maybe 50 different species of canines, only to suddenly see a large amount of extinction occurring. And Sanford and others would claim that this is genetic entropy. We're witnessing genetic entropy, right? Their genomes have, since the flood, since the creation, they've accumulated mutations, and they just have gotten to a point where there's too many, right? They're unfit for the environment, and their genomes have decayed and they're being lost. And so those numbers of species are going down. So if you combine that, the species are running out of variation to play with because there's only so much variation from the original creation. And creationists don't want to say they want to add new variation, at least, not very much of it. Some will begrudgingly say it happens once in a while, but it's still not a significant factor. It's not something that can transform an organism into something radically different. And so if variation is constantly being lost from the gene pool, then that also makes organisms depauperate of variation and less able to adapt to future environments, and it doesn't allow them to speciate. So we shouldn't expect this to turn around. We shouldn't expect these species losses in different groups to turn around. And so species are declining. Species are part of kinds. If too many species are lost, eventually the kind is lost. And so we were just talking about kinds starting here, and then the kinds decaying. Well, yes, now you have the kinds being lost. It's just a grim scenario any way you look at it, right? They're mostly feeding back on each other. They're all adding up to this is a huge problem. Young Earth creationists should be out there saying more forcefully to the rest of the world, look, if we're right, we need to do something about this, right? Because the future, and it's not like, we're not talking about 100,000 years from now, in their way of thinking, I think that it's looking at just a couple thousand years at most, if not much, much sooner. We should be seeing the serious effects of genomic decay. So forget global warming and all those other things which are threatening humanity. This genetic entropy thing is not only affecting us directly, but it's also affecting our entire food supply and the quality of life around us. Okay, so before I get to some final thoughts on this, and sort of what I've been thinking about and I've been kind of speculating about, let me just show you what the alternative scenario is in terms of diversity of life on Earth over time, because that's what we're talking about. We're talking about the trends in the diversity of life, numbers of species, numbers of families, genetic diversity over time. So I'm just going to show one figure. This is family diversity over time in the geological column. And this is family of, I believe this is animal families in total. And so, what this figure has is, all right, over here you have the number of families. So up here would be, almost 1,000 families here. And we see that if you go and this is tracing the geological column. So if you go before the Cambrian, there's not a whole lot of different forms of living things, especially animals, right? There might be a lot of bacteria, but there aren't any true animals until there's a few multicellular animals, and they're basically relegated to a single family originally, and then you have a couple families. And it's not until the Cambrian, which people talk about this Cambrian explosion thing, right? That the majority of different body plans originated during that time. Well, different body plans are going to be classified into different families eventually, because they have significant differences between them. So you see this increase in number of families, and this is, again, recorded in the rocks from the Cambrian, different identifiable body plans. And then that family level increase. Now, remember, families include many different species. And so this is looking at large groups. And this is just like looking at kinds for creationists, right? Creationists usually consider a kind about the level of a family. And so remember, they started out with all the families here present, and then massive drop, and then kind of like, okay, and now they're just gradually declining over time. So this is the creationist version of the history of life in terms of at this scale of family. And so in the geological column, we see great increase, and then we see several blips where many, many families are lost from the fossil record. That means all the members of the family are lost, not just a few species, but the entire family disappears. So like there's actually multiple families of trilobites, and all of the trilobites are gone. So that's multiple families that disappear. And these are various extinction, what are called the extinction events that are recorded in the geological column. In this case, they're looking at extinction events that they are mapping to large volcanic events that happened in Earth's history, which have a variety of different effects on the environment, which then affect living things. And so you can see the most dramatic extinction is the Permian extinction, in which almost 50% or so of all the different families, and a lot more species than that, but the families on Earth, even half of the families are lost. Oh, that's actually kind of similar to, so I'm just saying that in the creationist model, half of the families, actually more than half of the families, are lost right after the flood in a very short period of time. But of course, that doesn't really map at all onto this particular map because for them, every single one of these families, this is inside the geological column that's created by the flood, and they couldn't have gone extinct during the flood. They said they had to have survived the flood. They had to have gone extinct after the flood. So huge difference in views at this point. All right, so then the only thing I want to, the obvious thing on here, right, is what happens after that. You have a gradual increase in time of different families. This would be the evolution of distinctly different families, and there are more and more and more and more and more different families on Earth of animals, with one big extinction event occurring right here, which is at the Cretaceous Paleogene boundary, and that is the point of the Deacon Traps and the Chicxulub crater asteroid, which killed many, many species. For animals, it killed a number of different families, including dinosaur families, right? Which aren't present with us today. So this would be the contrasting view of life actually increasing in its diversity of families over time versus a constant decrease in families over time. The notable exception might be in the present, where there are several families that are in danger of extinction and fewer probably evolving at the same pace. And so there is the beginnings of a new extinction event occurring right now. All right, so now here's where it all comes together, I hope. The consequences of a young Earth creationist understanding of genetic entropy. Number one, the world is running down, right? This is part of, I'll say that this doesn't cause them to have this view. I think for many young Earth creationists, they already were coming from a worldview of the world is running down because it started in perfection, right? And then sin corrupts the world, and that corruption just continues. And so they see that everywhere, from culture, but also to just the decay of the physical substance of the world. The world is running down, and it has a limited lifespan ahead of it. I mean, everybody believes there's a limited lifespan to the world, right? It won't exist forever, but it's a lot shorter in their mind than for many's. There is nothing that can be done to stop this destruction, right? So, I mean, what are you going to do? Genetic entropy happens, and there's nothing you can do to combat it. We do these short-term, things of using technology in order to preserve ourselves and fix ourselves and extend our lives. But ultimately, genetic entropy is going to get us, right? Because it's going to destroy our genomes, and we won't be able to survive that no matter what. Species and even kinds or family losses are going to continue. That's another inevitable consequence of this belief in genetic entropy without the possibility of increasing information through other mechanisms. Or, and again, I don't want to get into all this genetic entropy at the genetic level, but the question of whether you can get rid of negative alleles. Do they have to constantly accumulate to the point where they destroy a species? Is that necessary? I don't think it is, but this isn't the place to talk about that. And there's plenty of other people that have dealt with that. New speciation events will be outpaced by extinctions. Young Earth creationists believe that speciation happens, that there are species that will divide into two groups of two populations that eventually will adapt to different locations and become what we call new species. And so, because after the flood, they see that thousands and thousands of species formed, right, from a small group of species. And so at that point, new speciation events were occurring extremely rapidly, and you could say they outpaced extinctions. But then at some point, extinctions caught up, right? And there was a point of equilibrium where there was just as many speciation events as there were extinctions. But then genetic entropy, loss of genetic variation just through other mechanisms of recombination, not recombination, but other mechanisms of vertical transmission inheritance, resulted in a loss of genetic variation, which then created greater opportunities for extinction than for speciation. And so they see that at that point, everything is just sliding downhill. The species that are left for us right now are becoming less and less fit for the environment. They don't see yes, they understand, most of them understand that natural selection is selecting for individual variations that might make them more fit for the environment. And yes, you can do experiments that show that organisms can become more fit, but ultimately they have to become less fit. And they'll point to a variety of different examples of this as well, of organisms that don't seem to be as fit today in their environment as maybe they were in the past. And they'll say that that's genetic entropy. They're accumulating mutations, they're decaying, and at some point they can no longer keep up with the pace of change they need to experience, or adaptation they need to experience in order to survive in this world. And that's the point at which they'll become extinct. The world can't continue long in the face of this genetic decay, right? I mean, isn't that the consequence of all this? I mean, the creationist looks out at the young earth creationist looks out at the world and says, it's been around for 6,000 years. How much longer is it going to be here? I mean, in 6,000 years, a whole lot has happened to this world. And everything's happened at an extremely fast pace, right? You only had 1,500 years before the flood, and then you had this flood, and then you had this massive explosion of speciation, and you had the continents turned around, and mountains formed, and like everything's happened really fast. And so, and it's been 4,000 years since that flood. All of this feeds into this idea that the world just can't stick around much longer. And here we now have the evidence for it. We have this, we have this genetic decay happening. And since it has to happen and it's inevitable and it's maybe even accelerating, what hope is there? All right. This world's not going to be around for another 1,000 years. It might not be around for another 200 years at the pace we're going. So then, now this is where it gets really practical, right? Have you ever wondered, and there's a variety of reasons why young earth creationists and their followers have the beliefs that they have, and this isn't going to explain it all. But I think either it does help, it is something that takes them to this position, or it's something where maybe they already held positions or views about climate change, species, diversity loss, and so forth. Maybe they already held views, didn't know exactly why they held those views, but now they have a reason to hold them when they see things like this. In other words, this information feeds into their belief system already, and just sort of continues to accentuate it, all right, or confirm it. So here, endangered species. Can't save them, so why try? I mean, honestly, if everything is decaying, and species are not doing very well, there's no way to save them, right? Because they're going to continue to accumulate mutations. Genetic entropy is taking them down. And if it's taking them down, why expend a lot of effort, trying to save any particular species? And really, why spend a whole lot of effort really saving the environment overall? Yes, care for the environment, be good stewards of the environment, but let's not go out of our way to think about trying to protect the environment for the generations thousands of years from now, because this world can't even exist thousands of years ago. And everyone around us should actually be able to see that already, because it's just like there. It's in the genome. We see, and if you knew the truth of young earth creationism, that we started with perfect genomes and all this is decaying, then you would know there's no point in worrying about these things. And that's where we get to something like climate change, right? Even if it's real, which many of them would dispute. There's a video on Creation Ministries International right now talking about climate change, and they basically poo-poo all the evidence of climate change and say we haven't really even proven that it's happening yet. But does it matter? Right? Does it matter? Even if it is real, it's not a big deal. It's not a big deal because you're talking about, changes that seem like they're going to be bad a couple hundred years from now, but let's face it, 200 or 300 years from now, or even 50 years from now, or maybe less, because I think many young earth creationists are on that, premillennial eschatology and believe that Christ is coming sooner rather than later. And this reinforces that, right? All this genetic stuff completely reinforces the idea that Christ is coming pretty soon, because there's just nothing to be coming back for, if he waits much longer. And that takes all the impetus out of thinking long range. It takes all the impetus about thinking about what to do about this world we live in now that God has created for us, and just say we're ready to abandon it, right? Because it's not savable. And so even if climate change is real, it's not really a big deal to us. Maybe that helps explain some of the attitudes that you see in this, and it also, I think, points out that bringing up topics like genetic entropy, getting people to believe in genetic entropy, sounding very sciencey, and oh yes, this has to be true. These are some of the long-term consequences of those beliefs, is that it reinforces these other ideas. So there we go. That's my meandering thoughts on genetic entropy and the endgame of genetic entropy. I feel like there's not enough discussion about the consequences of what young Earth creationists promote and propose. Many times some of these ideas are proposed because they're trying to solve a particular problem, or they're trying to, in this case, they're trying to use genetic entropy to prove the Earth is young. And maybe they haven't really thought through, okay, but what is the implications for the future? And do those make sense, right? Because asking yourself whether a theory overall makes sense, you need to explore all the ramifications of what that theory is potentially leading you to. And so I think that maybe one interesting avenue of discussion you might have with young Earth creationists is to ask them, just don't go right to the origins of the universe and the world, but maybe ask about their eschatological views. What are their views of the end times? When do they think that this world will come to an end, and how is it going to come to an end? Will they go right to 2 Peter 3 and it's going to be burnt up in fire? What exactly did they mean by that? Like physically, how do we get to that point? When do they think that will occur? If they think it's going to occur thousands of years from now, like they don't see any imminent return of Christ anytime soon, then you can actually have an interesting discussion about this genetic entropy thing, because you can say, well, what do you think the world's going to look like in another 1,000 years, given how much genetic diversity we've already lost over the last couple thousand years, given what the creationist model suggests is the history of the world to this point. If you project out to the future, are we only going to have just a couple species of plants and a couple species of animals left at that point? Is that the world you're really envisioning? And why would God allow that particular world to persist in that particular fashion? Or if they believe that the world is coming to a close very soon, it would be interesting to explore, why do they think that's the case? Do they think that's the case because, young Earth creationists, I think will have a tendency to believe that it will be very soon. And part of it's just this feeling of, hey, the world's only been around for 6,000 years, and look how much has happened in those 6,000 years, right? You had all this happen up to the flood. You had this massive flood. You had like the complete reformation of the earth. You had massive speciation occurring, and now you had massive extinctions happening. And they might actually start to really think it just can't persist in its present state. There's nothing to help it. There's no mechanism here to help it persist, especially when there's this overall driving feature, which is it started perfect and nothing can happen but decay. And therefore the world is running down. And that's why I started out with, hey, here's articles about how the world is running down, right? And there's nothing that can rescue it. And so this leads to a bit of a fatalistic, negative view, both of our culture of the times and ultimately our future and the future of everything on this earth. And as I said before, that then can lead you to interesting conversations about attitudes about global warming and the Endangered Species Act, and the purpose of life on Earth and our own purpose here on Earth during the time we have in it. All right, a lot to talk about, a lot to discuss. I would love to get some feedback, and so if you have any comments, please put them in the comments section. I will definitely pay attention to those. I'm most interested in how well you think my descriptions of the young Earth creationist model of species diversity over time, genetic diversity over time, and the effects of entropy, how in your mind might they interplay? Do you think my vision of everything decaying and essentially almost accelerating that decay over time is too pessimistic? Is there a way for a young Earth creationist to be optimistic about the future? The future maybe being 500 to 2,000 years out. Those are all, I think, really interesting things to think about. So thanks a lot for listening. We'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.